Hello, Voices of Wrestling listener. Dave Ryan here. Have you ever wondered to yourself how many hidden gems are hidden away inside the last years of World Championship Wrestling? Have you ever asked yourself how many tenuous gags can be made about the name Mike Enos? And have you ever thought about what it sounds like for two Irishmen to interpret a very chaotic company through its B show? The answers to all this and more are just a click away. Check out Days of Thunder every second Thursday on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
Hello, do you like New Japan Pro Wrestling? Are you a Shin Nihon freak? If so, check out the Super J-Cast with Joel and Damon on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
And even if you fucking hate New Japan Pro Wrestling, listen to the Super J-Cast anyway. Not just for our great show reviews, analysis, and pastrami sandwiches, but there's also usually some dick jokes somewhere in the obligatory opening 30 minutes of absolute nonsense we chat about every single week. That's the Super J-Cast for all the best talk about New Japan Pro Wrestling, crisps, and pornography.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings, and joining with me today is my Wrestlenomics co-host. He is what is your official title at Wrestlenomics, Brandon? We haven't really gotten over this before because you're not the founder, because that's Mookie.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mookie is not involved anymore.
Mookie is not involved at all.
I am the sole owner, I guess. I think I usually tell people editor/owner.
Yeah, owner, proprietor.
Yeah,
publisher. That's an old-fashioned term that we would use.
Publisher.
For our news outlets. But joining me is Brandon Thurston, who you can find every Sunday at 11 a.m. hosting Wrestlenomics. I'm co-host on that show, as well as Chris Gullo, which I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with. You also are now hosting. Is the Pollock and Thurston show? Is that now officially a weekly thing?
I think so. There are graphics. There was a discussion along the lines of, yes, we're going to do this every week. I guess like any podcast, we might take a week off here or there, but we've been doing it every week for 10 weeks, I think.
And can you describe the kind of like what that show is, or what kind of the purpose of that show is?
At the moment, we have a guest on, with the exception of the earnings call, when it's a W earnings call week. On that week, and probably in the future, and it will just be John and I. But we have a guest on for 20 to 45 minutes, and then we talk a bit after just about the latest news in wrestling business.
And people can find that on the Post Wrestling feed.
They can, and they can find it on the Wrestlenomics feed, both in the case of podcast feeds and in the case of YouTube as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you could have watched Forbidden Door on New Japan World, or you could watch it on a pay-per-view provider.
Well, if you live in Japan, you could have watched Forbidden Door on New Japan World, right? This is global, no matter where you are.
Right. But everyone knows, of course, Brandon, that you're closely follow the economics of pro wrestling and your knowledge of the different business deals involving the professional wrestling industry. But I don't know, do people know that you were an independent wrestler for a long time and that you have experience as an in-ring performer?
I don't know, do they? It's not something that I try to lean on a lot, I guess. It's because I know that I'm not I obviously didn't wrestle for major companies or anything like that. And as far as an indie wrestler goes, it's not like I traveled as much as indie wrestlers that people listening to this are probably most familiar with. I wrestled for a long time, but I had not as many matches as much more well-traveled people did. And I'm not I don't believe in all this ad hominem stuff that I hear a lot of other people use to, say, well, I know because I was in the ring. And I think I've learned a lot from people who'd never been in the ring about how wrestling works and things like that. So I think, people who have wrestled obviously have valuable experience, but
yeah. And I was thinking about this yesterday. And it's perfect kind of to the topic related to what we're going to discuss today. But I was thinking that despite the fact that like 1 million wrestlers have their own podcasts or are involved in some sort of media pursuit. There aren't really a lot of former pro wrestlers that are in like I don't know, I want to call it critical analysis of pro wrestling media, or more like kind of the hardcore wrestling fan serving media. Like, I mean, like a lot of these wrestlers that have podcasts recapping their career and kind of talking about stories from the road and things that they learned and things like that. But as far as like people that are analyzing the day-to-day business of pro wrestling and the day-to-day storylines, there really isn't that many wrestlers. Like when you compare it to another sport, like if you want to hear someone talk about the NBA today, like every NBA player that's involved in media is talking about would talk about the NBA today or any other sport. But in pro wrestling, like there's Lance Storm at Figure Four Wrestling. There's Brian Alvarez, obviously, who's
Does
similar
Matt
to
Morgan
you.
still review
I don't
Raw?
think Matt does anything, but Matt was involved on Wrestling Inc. for a while, but I don't think he does anything anymore. But when you look at like who is kind of like going over wrestling each week, there aren't a lot of actual former pro wrestlers with substantial experience involved. And I kind of thought that was a little unusual because of how much, time and how much entertainment there is both in people following wrestling day to day and also all these wrestlers that have podcasts. Yet at the same time, we don't have a ton of wrestlers that are involved in like what I would call popular uh mediums for day-to-day pro wrestling analysis, talking about the current product. Almost all of the former pro wrestlers are involved in like nostalgia based things, and it's obviously easier for them to talk about it. It doesn't require them to stay up to date on everything. It doesn't require them to watch the product each week, which is a significant time commitment, as everyone knows. But it is kind of allows for, I think, like a shortage of really experienced people to talk about things like we're talking about today when we're looking at the landscape of how are pro wrestlers being trained, how is talent being developed, how are they being pushed and marketed. And there just aren't a lot of people with your level of experience or more in that kind of field, I feel like.
I should review content more. Is the moral of the story here? I don't know. The closest thing I can think of for what you're thinking about there is I remember this was years ago, I guess now. Does Steve Austin still do his podcast? But anyway, I remember he would have like Wade Keller and maybe even had Meltzer on at times, and they would like review a pay-per-view. So not like a Raw. They weren't doing weekly stuff, but when there was a pay-per-view, they would, he would go basically review the show, I thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if Steve does. I definitely don't think he does that anymore. I think he maybe does his show where he'll interview talent. And I think that's kind of relatively infrequent. I haven't looked at it in a while. I mean, Chris Jericho has his own pod, right? As an active wrestler, there are active wrestlers with podcasts. But even Jericho, Jericho will like interview like fellow wrestlers, and they'll talk about like the industry. But as far as like, I guess like being connected with like a larger entity of wrestling media, we don't have many people doing that.
Why do you think that is? I would guess it's part of it is just the subjective nature of wrestling, and to go out there and inevitably, if you're going to do it honestly, critique your I don't know if they're your peers, but if you're older retired wrestler or something like that, and you're talking about what's happening currently, it seems like a lightning rod for getting heat with people, or putting into doubt whether you're going to be brought into WWE or AEW
right. If you
for a
want a
brief
job
appearance.
somewhere,
Right.
It might hurt your ability to do it honestly, like you said. I think it's a time commitment thing. Like it's a lot of it. Like you're gonna watch Dynamite and Raw and SmackDown and Collision every week. You're gonna watch the pay-per-views each week, every few weeks when they come out. That's a lot of commitment. And if people got other things going on, if they're retired pro wrestlers, they have maybe other business interests or whatever, or they just don't want to follow the business that closely.
And I think that the difference is as you're thinking of like the analysts who sit there at the desks at before the NBA, NFL games and so forth, there's at least an objective thing that they can measure about whether somebody won or lost the game, or what the stats are. And in wrestling, obviously there are wins and losses, but they're predetermined, and they're based on somebody's subjective judgment about what direction they want the company and the creative to go in. So I just think there's more of a in legit sports, you're able to lean on, the wins and losses and the score and the stats as like, well, you can't really blame them for criticizing, so and so who's in a slump, because I mean, look at the numbers. It's objective and plain as day, and there's no controversy about it. In wrestling, it's different. We have business numbers, but those are an animal unto themselves.
So the topic today, and what I was thinking about this yesterday, was about 10 years ago, the way that talent is developed in professional wrestling, especially major television talent in the United States is developed in pro wrestling, goes through a really significant shift, which is WWE, who had been using various independent wrestling groups as kind of a training school for their talent. They were associated with the USWA in the 90s in Memphis. They had, a long relationship with Ohio Valley Wrestling in the early 2000s. They had, they used some like Deep South Wrestling down in Georgia for a brief period of time. And then, of course, Florida Championship Wrestling towards the later ends of the 2000s and into the early 2010s. And they decide to kind of transform Florida Championship Wrestling into NXT, the WWE Performance Center, which was in a lot of ways pouring a lot more investment and formalizing a lot of how they were going to train talent and providing kind of a more corporate look to training and evaluating potential wrestlers. I think that's fair to say. And now that we have, and that changes everything. And at the same time, WWE also becomes much more accepting of signing wrestlers who were trained on the independents, wrestlers who had extensive experience outside of a WWE developmental territory, something that they had been hesitant to do for, the prior 15 years. You can start with like CM Punk as kind of the first real independent wrestler that had a name on the indies to kind of get a crack in WWE. Bryan Danielson follows. Seth Rollins comes in towards, the end of the 2000s. And you start seeing kind of a different, so you have those two changes. You have WWE starting to pick up independent talent, and you also have the creation of the Performance Center. And that changes kind of everything in how talent would develop for everywhere, both on the independents and, of course, within WWE. And now that 10 years have gone by, we have a little bit more time and perspective to see on how things have changed, what kind of talent have come through the pipeline, how that has impacted talent both in WWE and outside of WWE. And I'll start with this, Brandon, like as someone who has, trained wrestlers before, and when you first kind of were able to wrap your head around the WWE Performance Center and kind of what they were doing in Orlando, what were your kind of initial thoughts on how this would impact? How would this be as far as training talent? Like, were you impressed with what they were doing?
I guess, I mean, the reason why they opened the Performance Center, among the reasons, is to recruit people. I imagine they had trouble recruiting, or certainly they would more easily recruit athletes if you're able to say, look at our world-class training center in a nice area in Florida, it's in Orlando, as opposed to sending you to a warehouse in Louisville, Kentucky, or something like that. I mean, they have all the resources in the world, and there should be no reason why they shouldn't be able to succeed really well at training wrestlers.
And this is something we've talked about a lot before. Now that we're kind of, because the Performance Center opens, I think it opens in 2013, does it not?
July 2013.
Yeah, so we're literally 10 years. That was kind of incidental on my end, but we're recording this on June 30th. So we're basically 10 years on from the Performance Center. And how would you describe the output of talent over those 10 years from the WWE Performance Center?
Well, the opening of it, so in July 2013, and I think there's this big shift in Paul Levesque's philosophy around mid to late 2014, where he starts to, I mean, I've talked about this before, where you can listen to the media calls that he would do around that time, where in early 2014 he says that it's easier to just retrain, to take somebody as a blank slate because they don't have the bad habits, and we want to run a certain playbook, and sometimes people are so used to running their playbook that it's easier to just bring somebody in from scratch and train them that way. And by the end of the year, he's hiring Kevin Owens, Finn Balor, Kenta, and it just progresses from there in terms of embracing wrestlers who had experience outside and sort of bringing the buzz that they have with them into the company through the takeovers and all that. But you're asking about the output specifically over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Who do we got here? That I would say. So I've done like data studies on this, right? And it's, where do you draw the line about when it's, because you could draw the line at like July 2013 and say, okay, everybody who started to have matches at that point, but all those people had a lot of their experience already from FCW. So you might want to start a little bit after that. In any case, who are the wrestlers that come to mind as being really pure PC projects who have made, who've had success on the main roster? Bianca Belair comes to mind. Alexa Bliss, Liv Morgan, mostly women here. Who else?
Braun Strowman?
Braun Strowman, yes. Baron Corbin, certainly.
Omos?
Yes. The Giant.
So
what else?
But realistically, when we're looking at when they would talk on the investors calls about the WWE Performance Center, it was always presented as, this is where we're going to create the next John Cena. This is where we're going to create the next Roman Reigns, the next Rock, the next Steve Austin. It's always, presented, and I'm sure the goals were, we are going to find our next super duper big stars, and we're going to produce them ourselves. And that hasn't been the case. Like, we can point to Baron Corbin has had a nice career, all things considered. I'm sure he's made a substantial amount of money. He's wrestled for many years on WWE television. I believe he's headlined at least one pay-per-view before. But he is not the kind of person that you would look at and say, like, that is the kind of talent we want to produce out of the Performance Center. But he is probably one of the biggest successes from the Performance Center. And I think that's hard to stomach. If you're looking at it, this was supposed to be the proving ground for our next tremendous generation of pro wrestlers.
So we have Nia Jax is another one you could say. She certainly had a lot of time on the main roster.
And yeah, and success is so relative in the sense of, like, from my end, I'm looking at it as like, okay, who are like the big stars that you produced? And the answer is not that many. Other internally from WWE, I have no idea. They might look at someone like Omos, who they took from scratch as an, extremely like a limited athlete, and they think that they've gotten a ton out of him because he's, wrestled big matches at WrestleMania, and he's been on pay-per-views, and he's made it to television. And to a degree, that is success. And is that the kind of person you're looking to produce out of the Performance Center? To an extent, yes, but I would think most people would look at Omos and be like, well, he really shouldn't be a shining example because he's simply not very good. And there's a real limit to how you can use him.
I mean, when in terms of what they will say on an earnings call, and then there's not so much of this talk these days, but certainly in the years after the Performance Center opened, they would basically credit people like Sami Zayn to the Performance Center. Basically, anybody who came through the Performance Center, including Nakamura and people like that, who had a lot of experience, obviously, before they came to WWE, they were all being referred to as, people who we trained at the Performance Center. I'm just looking through the list of people who have had like the most PLE matches, and like who of these people would I say is there are some edge cases, like, Sasha Banks, I would say, is somebody who had some indie experience, but most of it FCW and NXT, right?
Right. There's a lot of gray cases in the case of, did this person benefit from going to the Performance Center or working at NXT? Absolutely. I think someone like, I'm sure Sami Zayn benefited in some ways of wrestling in NXT instead of just going right to the main roster, but he's largely the same wrestler that he was before he came to WWE. But for someone like, Sasha Banks or Bayley, or these people that had more limited independent experience. So I'm looking at this Money in the Bank card. This is, Money in the Bank, which is tomorrow, and is one of their, 5 or 6 biggest shows of the year. I would say traditionally. And I'm looking at like who is on this card that you could chop up to being a product of the WWE Performance Center. And I'm looking at all of these names, and I would say you have Liv Morgan, who I believe had no experience before being signed by WWE, but I'm not sure about that.
She might have had a couple indie matches, but I
Yeah.
would say it's not nothing significant.
You have Raquel Rodriguez, who is, I think, in a similar vein. She was trained by Booker T, but had most of her career has been in WWE, had limited experience. So that's two. You have Dominic Mysterio, whose training is kind of uncertain as far as.
How about Ronda Rousey? Like, what do you do about cases like Ronda
Well, I
Rousey?
was gonna bring up her and another person that's on this card as kind of separate cases. So you have Liv. Let's be generous. Say Liv Morgan, Raquel Rodriguez, Dom Mysterio. Zoe Stark is another person who's kind of like a Sasha Banks kind of style, where she has more indie experience than I think Liv Morgan or Raquel Rodriguez, but not necessarily a ton. She was wrestling on Championship Wrestling from Hollywood for a few years before coming to WWE, so she's kind of on the borderline. And then you have Solo Sikoa, who is like really, to me, like the only 100% Performance Center generated person that's on this card. You also have Logan Paul and Ronda Rousey, who are different for a lot of reasons, where they were trained by the Performance Center, but were not typical WWE trainee signees. Were not developed the same way, did not spend a year in NXT, did not work the Florida house show loop to get get reps in at pro wrestling. They're totally different entities as celebrity kind of wrestlers. But you look at this Money in the Bank card, which is, again, we have 10 years of the Performance Center, and there's a lot of people on the show because you have so many multi-person matches. And you really only have a handful of people that could be even considered to be Performance Center wrestlers. And what does that say about the Performance Center? And kind of more importantly, what does that say about how WWE has been able to develop talent over the last 10 years?
Like, on one hand, you'd say, well, look, they've got nobody here who's a pure project, or very few people here who we would call pure PC projects.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably something wrong with the Performance Center. I mean, I sort of lean toward in that direction. To make a case that is kind of reasonable, is pretty reasonable, I think, though, that you could say, well, do you necessarily need to create everybody from scratch, or should you necessarily have, say, half this card or most of this card consist of wrestlers who we trained from scratch? We brought them in from athletics and put them in the Performance Center and train them how to be wrestlers for the first time? Or is it just appropriate and natural that in WWE, which is the biggest wrestling company in the world, we've got a lot of talent who came in here and, they had a lot of wrestling experience beforehand, and they graduated up to the point where they're with us now, and we're trying to get the most out of them. I think both of those things are probably true, that there's something wrong with the Performance Center. I would guess. I've never been there. I couldn't tell you what exactly is happening there day to day and what their training is truly like. But I think it is also natural that, I think WWE just has a very different philosophy about what wrestling should be, beyond the extent that I think it is really appropriate for marketing purposes. Overwhelmingly, I think that's instilled by Vince McMahon and the philosophical legacy that he's instilled into the company. So that I think that's sort of out of match with the market and with what wrestling is and could be. So I think that is sort of that is skewing a lot of the evaluation, I think.
Right. And like, you could look at this card, and I would say that from a WWE perspective, just like as a fan, like, it's a good card. There's major matches on the card. There's a lot of good wrestlers on the card. It's has a lot of people that are over on it. It's not like the product is a disaster because they have no talent, and because they can't develop their own talent. That's why they have no talent. That's not the case. The WWE has plenty of talent. They have signed a lot of really good wrestlers. A lot of them are on this show. They've still got a lot of people from the FCW days that are contributing. Obviously, that main event, which is Roman Reigns is an FCW wrestler. The Usos are also FCW wrestlers. That's 3/4 of your main event. So you're still seeing contributions on that end. So it's not like the company is necessarily in a dire need to develop its own talent. It's more of just like has been a stated goal of theirs, and it doesn't seem to have come to fruition. And I agree with you in that I think WWE and Vince McMahon specifically have a very particular view on like what they want to teach people to become pro wrestlers. And I think NXT 2.0 and what that kind of brand has turned into over the last 18 months has given us a lot more insight into that, which is we want wrestlers who look a certain way, who probably played a sport in college, who have a character that they can project onto the screen. Maybe that's Carl Fredericks being a DJ. Maybe that's, Tony D'Angelo being a mobster. Maybe that's Wendy Chu pretending that she's really sleepy or something like that. It might not be a good gimmick, but it is a personality that can project. And that's what they're really focused on. Not necessarily the same things that other institutions that are training and developing pro wrestlers are focused on. And in WWE's mind, it's because WWE isn't pro wrestling, it's sports entertainment, and it's very different. And what our talent needs to be good at is different than what someone that is in the New Japan Pro Wrestling Dojo needs to be good at, or someone that AEW is looking at, or someone that an indie wrestling school is looking at. And that's their perspective on it. I think that probably shapes a lot of what comes out of NXT. But even if that's true, even if the idea is, well, we're training people differently because we're different. We're training sports entertainers. We're not training pro wrestlers. We're getting these blue chip athletes right out of college. Even if that's true, wouldn't it still reason to wonder why none of those people are on this card, or none of these people have real significant impacts within WWE? The people that do have significant impacts are people that were trained as pro wrestlers, not trained as sports entertainers. And internally, if I was WWE, I would really be looking at those results and be like, maybe this isn't working.
Yeah, I think there should be more results than there are of pure athletes who came in to the company that has the most resources to turn them into great wrestlers. I mean, the justification for doing the NIL program, which is it's a more advanced recruitment of athletes than they've ever done before, is they point to examples like Big E and Roman Reigns as athletes who had prior in their case. Was Big E a football player?
Yeah, he was. He played football at the University of Iowa.
And look at wrestlers who came in from other athletic endeavors, and they came in and became very good wrestlers with no wrestling experience. In both of those cases, certainly. Also, pre-PC was a lot of their development, right? It was in FCW,
right? And obviously, Roman is a multi-generational wrestler, which probably gives you some advantage. And if you look at who are real standouts of WWE trained talents in recent years, I would look at, first of all 4 members of that main event: Solo Sikoa, Roman Reigns, and the Usos are all 2nd generation wrestlers. If not 3rd generation in Solo's case. I'm not sure quite what the family tree is.
Hard to follow.
right. But all people who had, parents that grew up in wrestling, obviously, yes. Which is different. Charlotte Flair is another one of someone who I would say has been a success from a WWE trained perspective. Obviously a 2nd generation wrestler there. So you look at some of those names and be like, okay, that gives you maybe a different head start. And WWE, to their credit, has always been pretty good at developing 2nd generation wrestlers. You can look at The Rock, you can look at Randy Orton, you can look at Cody Rhodes. That has always been something that they've been actually good at doing over the years.
Tamina
Snuka is another one. Yes. I mean, there's a lot more. And there's, you look at, Braun Breaker in NXT right now. Obviously there's tons everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And we talk about like, the Performance Center. You have the NIL deal, right? It didn't. So you said it as kind of a recruitment method, which makes sense, which is WWE paying athletes while they're in college, with the idea being that they'll be more likely to consider a career in WWE once they graduate college, and are looking at the next step of their future. And if it's not going to be playing a sport at the professional level, is WWE a good option? And the idea is like, do you think I don't really get the sense that it was like, and maybe they would obviously have a much better insight on this, but I never got the sense that it was like a challenge for WWE to get former college athletes to come work for them. It obviously helps to have the Performance Center. It obviously helps to have NIL deals, but you could see like they were signing talent all the time that were, and they would give out the press release and they would say like, oh, this person came in, this guy, former, football player at the University of Portland, and this woman, former track and field star from, Texas A&M University or whatever. It didn't seem like there was like historically a shortage of WWE being able to recruit college athletes. Yet the NIL deals seem to be connected in the sense of we want to be even better at doing that, or they want higher caliber athletes. Does that really make a difference?
I think, I don't know, it definitely enhances their ability to do it, because it's not just hiring, but actually sponsoring and waiting for them to come in. It seems like something that has a Nick Khan flavor to it, in that, like, this is what would be done in a sports organization. This is what we should do. We should just sponsor people. And he's made the argument that there are, not even looking beyond football, which is their main area for male athletes, but look at all these sports that don't have a pro sports league, that, it's basically a college sport and then that's it. And as he would say, and then there's no place for them to go. Well, they can go to WWE. So
right, I always thought NIL in some ways was used as like a marketing plan for WWE, especially when they talk to the media, talking about and investors, like, we got this new thing, NIL. Look, this revolutionary idea where we go to a good college football player, but they're not going to make the NFL. And we say, what if you give pro wrestling a try? As if that's been a method that's been used for like literally 100 years to recruit people to professional wrestling, but it's being used kind of as a, oh, this is a new idea, when it's been done for generations. The only difference is now you can pay college athletes formally through the NIL deals that are the real difference. And so WWE can be listed as a sponsor of a college athlete. I wanted to ask you this, as someone who has trained a lot of pro wrestling talents. When you were training talents, did you ever do like athletic evaluations the way that they sometimes get talked about in NXT? Like, do you ever have people do bench press and sprints and time them and things like that?
There was no combine, but we would do a tryout. Professional wrestling being professional wrestling, and I feel like this is kind of controversial, but like, professional wrestling being professional wrestling, especially on the indie level, you get every type of person comes through the door. And I was very strict. I wanted people to be in shape, because I mean, like, the way I looked at it is like, I wanted this to be worth my time. And I was afraid that we would get classes full of people who were not in a great position to succeed because they were not already in good physical shape. And like the classic case against this is like, well, we had Puff, and I wouldn't train Puff for a while. And
this was a storyline.
Yes,
beyond wrestling, was that you've refused to train Puff.
Basically, I mean, that wouldn't be inaccurate. He still hung out at the gym and like did stuff.
And for people who don't know, Puff is an independent wrestler who's a super heavyweight.
Yes,
in the Buffalo area. That was one of Brandon's students, basically.
Sort of, because I wouldn't train. And most of I think he had maybe a little bit of training before he came to us, but and then he just like had a practice match at an Ethan Page seminar that we had at the school, and he did really well. And I had to like admit, all right, we gotta let you train now. But that's the classic case. I mean, like, I was trying to do sort of a poor man's like New Japan dojo, and I wanted, excellent athletes to come in and be ready to go, and to not have these large class sizes where most of your time is spent sitting around, waiting for everybody else to train. I have no idea what the Performance Center is like. Maybe this is part of the issue. I don't know. But like, I wanted really small classes with people who attended really regularly, so that we could, effectively train them, and have them do everything a lot to sort of to build the neural pathways in their brains to like automatically know how to do the fundamentals of pro wrestling. But that's that's probably a part of why we were able to train, a handful of wrestlers that you've heard of. I think is because we wanted smaller class sizes and we wanted, people who are in shape already.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about like from an athletic standpoint. Like, I think naturally it is logical for one to consider that if someone is a better athlete, maybe they played a sport in college, maybe they were a really good high school athlete, maybe they're just someone who's really fast and can jump higher, is naturally strong. Those people would typically be better professional wrestlers because they are really athletic, and wrestling is an inherently athletic exercise. But I'm curious to know, like, if like the best athletes that you trained would end up being the best wrestlers that you trained, because that kind of seems how WWE wants to operate, which is WWE wants to get the highest level college athletes they can get. They want to get people that can maybe have the most impressive measurables, with the idea being that those people are going to be the best professional wrestlers. But given that professional wrestling, while an athletic endeavor, is also an art form, and there are so many other factors that go into making someone a successful professional wrestler than just them being naturally athletic, I'm curious to know, like, kind of how that translates in terms of like, this person was an incredible athlete and therefore they ended up becoming a professional wrestler, or vice versa. This, because wrestling, if you look at wrestling, it's filled with people who are, extremely athletic, but there's also many successful professional wrestlers that probably wouldn't fare too well in like a combine style evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a great athlete. But on a certain level, I was a decent wrestler. Um, I don't know that we ever really had somebody who like, I don't know, competed in college athletics.
Right.
Not really. So it's hard to say. Um, People who were athletic and who were at least in shape to start with tended to do better. But what also I think was a good predictor about whether somebody was going to take to this well, besides just attending all the time, was that, whether they had an aptitude for wrestling or had, I guess, like a wrestling intelligence. Did they have a passion for a wide variety of wrestling styles? I hesitate because is this like gatekeeping? But like, if they were into wrestling beyond just what was available to them on television, had they studied wrestling, not, you don't have to be a tape trader anymore, but had they studied wrestling online through YouTube and stuff like that, were they, exploring a wide variety of, of styles of wrestling that were not just available on their, basic cable package. That told me, maybe in my bias, but told me that, this is somebody who is really willing to explore a variety of wrestling and can really love it from all angles, and is into the work of wrestling, is into the way that matches happen and the styles that they have. So I mean, so there's all that, and ultimately, what the first thing we have to do is teach them fundamentals. And there are people who take to it really quickly. Like, I think Daniel Garcia was one. And there are people who it's hard to teach fundamentals to, even if they, like, we had some people who had, maybe had like a high school football background, so they had at least, participated in sports, in their academic career, but weren't necessarily coordinated in a way that you need to be, to take well to the fundamentals of pro wrestling.
Right. Someone having like a really good bench press, or maybe being able to run a fast 100-meter dash, is different than being a pro wrestler. And if you can look at WWE you can look at the Performance Center, and you can say, man, there's a lot of these people that were extremely accomplished athletes, and they just, whatever reason, like, I always thought like Mojo Rawley to me was always is always a good example of somebody like this, because from what I can get, first of all, Mojo Rawley was an incredible athlete, just from everything you would kind of want out of like a professional wrestler. Big, really strong, really quick, can jump really high. From what I could tell, seemed to have a passion for pro wrestling, or at least WWE style pro wrestling. He seemed like someone that wasn't there just to try to make money, but seemed like he really liked professional wrestling. And despite years and years of being in WWE, he was still clumsy. He was still not a very good technical pro wrestler. He still lacked a lot of the basic fundamentals that you would need to be successful in pro wrestling. And was that because of poor instruction? Was that because of lack of effort? Or was that because of, a lack of just him? He just wasn't ever going to be able to get it, because it's just it's a certain set of skills that some people inherently are going to have and are going to not, some people are inherently not going to have.
It could be like, I think a lot of it is footwork. Like we had one student who comes to mind who, maybe more than one, who maybe had a football background, and wanted to take all these steps. And what you want to do in pro wrestling, especially when you learn the fundamentals, it's important to teach somebody how to step efficiently. Because one of the main things that we often have to teach out of people is don't take so many steps, and for whatever reason, some people want to run in place, and maybe that's a football thing. I don't know. I played like 1 year of football when I was like 11, so hard to say.
Right. So, and I think it's, that whole aspect of it is interesting to me in the sense of, I think wrestling has never been more athletic as a style, as far as like what is kind of demanded by talent. That happens a lot when we have a lot more smaller athletes in like major wrestling positions than we have in history. So inherently, it's probably going to get a little bit quicker. There's more of an emphasis on being athletic and doing high spots and things like that. And so you would think that would pave the way for a lot of these really good athletes. But I don't know. It's kind of interesting. Like I remember like Dave and Brian were interviewing Sammy Guevara once, and Brian asked like, "Oh, what sports did you do?" Like Brian, because Sammy's obviously, a very athletic wrestler. And he basically just said like, no, I never did sports or anything. Like I never played football or gymnastics or anything like that. He was just like a guy that learned how to do flips and stuff while he was training to be a pro wrestler. And I always thought that was kind of fascinating in the sense of, here's someone who, whether you're a huge fan of Sammy or not, it's, obvious that he is, a good professional wrestler and can do a lot of the athletic stuff that is required and can get over doing athletic stuff. Yet his athletic background is pretty much non-existent from a formal perspective. And I wonder if he did like, the NXT Performance Center Combine, how he would even fare. Yet he's, as far as a wrestler, he's much more athletic than many of the people who would probably do very well in the combine.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of wrestlers who don't have any athletic background, and I don't think it's something that's necessary. Like as far as, again, I don't know that we had all these like athletic specimens, but I think most of the wrestlers who we trained had a little bit of sports background at best. I think Daniel had some hockey background. Kevin Blackwood, I don't know, had any athletic background. Megabyte Ronnie had a competitive eating background.
Yeah, I mean, he was a professional. Was he not? He was a professional athlete.
He's still going. He was doing the Nathans or something. He's trying out or something. He's still going now. But yeah, do you know Mr. Brickster? I think he had some football background.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's I have no real athletic background beyond like age 12. I played a lot of indoor soccer as a adolescent. But I was not doing any sort of high school athletics. I decided after I was already wrestling, and like after the Benoit murder and suicide had happened, I kind of was disenchanted with wrestling for that reason and for other reasons. And I did a year of amateur wrestling to serve pro wrestling, basically. And that's like the most academic athletic thing I've ever done.
Yeah, and if you were to look at, I'm looking again, just to use this Money in the Bank card, which of course is WWE. It's the highest level. I'm looking at like how many of these people were like college athletes. Roman Reigns was.
Matt Riddle is a professional athlete, I would say.
Right. Matt Riddle obviously is a professional athlete.
Ronda Rousey was an Olympian.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. So obviously Rousey is obviously a
Shayna
decade.
Baszler
Rousey
was
and
a
Riddle.
pro MMA
Shayna,
fighter.
obviously.
Yeah.
Raquel, I believe, was a college basketball player.
Cody was a very good high school wrestler, right?
Yes, Cody was I think he was a state champion amateur wrestler, and I believe he had like scholarships to go like wrestle at like Penn State or like a Big Ten school, but elected to go into pro wrestling. But Cody was a capable amateur athlete, but not a college, but did not, actually perform in college.
Nakamura is an athlete, right? Certainly an MMA fighter.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Now Nakamura
He's capable of winning.
Had a combat sports background. I'm looking at these other people. I don't know if Damian Priest, I don't know what his high school athletic or college, if he played a sport in college. It's obviously very big, so it's possible. I don't know if Solo was it wouldn't surprise me if he was a college football player, but I'm not sure about that. But there's plenty of people on here who are not athletes in college and things like that. And that's even at the WWE level. So it's not obviously mandatory. But if you look at who WWE signs, it's often looking at college athletes and things like that. I wanted to kind of shift.
Solo Sikoa played football at American River College and Dickinson State University.
Dickinson State?
This is what I don't know what that is. Is that something significant?
No. I believe it's in Ohio.
He played football though in college.
Yeah, but anyway, I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit. And since we talked about WWE, I wanted to talk about AEW, which has a different kind of approach to talent development. In the sense of, obviously, unlike WWE, AEW does not have a formal training center that they recruit non-athletes to and train. Now, they have recruited some people who come from athletics that did not have prior wrestling experience. Jade Cargill is obviously one of them. Satnam Singh is another one. Anthony Ogogo, as guys who had professional sport experiences or college sport experiences. They've also had wrestlers like Hook, who I guess was a college athlete, but had no prior pro wrestling experience. I don't think Brock Anderson had prior pro wrestling experience. I think one of the Guns, I want to say it was, I don't know if it's Austin or Colton, but one of them has only wrestled for AEW, basically. They never wrestled before AEW. So we do see people who they have got from scratch. I would say the results have been mixed, but it's only a few years, of since they've been developing it. But they also have, they've signed a lot of talent who are at very early stages of their careers before AEW signed them. And a lot of that was due to WWE being very aggressive in signing talent and a kind of an arms race to sign young independent talent, which led to them signing a lot of wrestlers who didn't have extensive independent wrestling experience, that were kind of just breaking out on their own, and then they get signed. And now that we're kind of a few years removed from them signing talent like Top Flight, signing some of the women's talent that they've signed, people like Layla Hirsch, people like even like Chris Statlander, although she had a little bit more indie experience. How like AEW's talent development, which is largely reliant, it seems like, on people getting reps on the now discontinued AEW Dark, or occasional television work, and how talent has kind of developed in AEW under its 4 year existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want an indictment of WWE's philosophy that they have to teach everybody their way before they can work on television, I mean, why was AEW able to put mostly wrestlers who have never worked in WWE onto television and have the relative success that they've had? I know their viewership is like half or a third of what WWE's is, but it's still a show, it's still a promotion that is able to, be one of the most watched shows on Wednesday and sell over 100,000 pay-per-view buys for their shows, and sell 65,000 tickets at Wembley. So what are they doing in WWE that is so essential that you really have to, be exposed to their magic potion? I mean, I don't know what it is. And AEW existed without any of that, without any training center. In AEW's case, though, I would say I would be encouraging more wrestlers to work the indies, and I don't know what the incentives are here that are, to my view. I mean, I could be wrong, but to my view, that a lot of the wrestlers in AEW don't have a lot of pre-AEW experience, are not working the indies very much. I don't know if they're worried about injuries or if they're worried about other things, worried about the quality of the shows that they'd be working. But I think it would, behoove the Jade Cargills and the Hooks and the Guns and things like that to be working the indies as much as possible to get that experience that I don't think they're really efficiently going to get in AEW alone.
Yeah, and I think that now that we're kind of a few years removed from AEW, establishing itself, and we have a little bit of time to kind of go back and look at people that they've signed, have the talent. And part of it is WWE has the advantage in the sense that they have NXT. They've restarted the Florida house shows. They have these wrestlers who can work a lot without necessarily having to be on television all the time. And AEW has a very large roster. It's a very competitive roster in the sense of the talents that you are being forced to go up against. And if you're a wrestler like a Darius Martin and you have like a couple of years of indie experience, you're in your early 20s, it's in your, the people that you're competing with TV time for are Bryan Danielson and Kenny Omega and CM Punk and the Young Bucks, or people like MJF, Sting, or Chris Jericho. It's going to be tough for you to find work each week on television. And if you're not working each week on television, where are you working? We've seen some AEW talent work on the indies, but some talent doesn't. And it seems to be almost like kind of a personal choice of whether or not someone wants to dedicate.
I'm looking at Jade Cargill's cage match. She's never had a match outside of AEW or
No.
the Jericho Cruise. None.
No. And some wrestlers do work a lot of independents. I know like Max Caster worked a ton of independent dates last year. And I actually think Max Caster is one of the most improved wrestlers on the AEW roster. I think he's significantly better as an in-ring wrestler than he was when he first started. It helps that he's got, his gimmick is over and, he's now someone that's going to get TV matches on a regular basis. But that probably wasn't the case when he was first signed. And I think that is I think you're right in the sense of, I think AEW signed a lot of talent, but with limited TV time, and yes, you add AEW Collision, but when you lose Dark, but they've lost the Darks, and the Darks were a place for people to kind of get reps without any real pressure on them.
Yeah, and we criticized WWE for warehousing talent would be the phrase, right? And for basically defensively signing talent to keep them away from AEW and other competitors. And I think there's something to AEW. They've signed so much talent, and how are they going to develop if you don't use them? I'm looking at Jade Cargill's cage match still, and 24 matches in 2022, and the most recently completed full year. She had 16 through 5 months of this year. So I mean, if you I know she's going to be inactive or whatever for whatever reason, and so if you doubled that, that's like 32 matches in a year. That's not enough, I think, to develop a wrestler who really still needs to be developed. All these relationships with all these other companies around the world, DDT and New Japan and so forth, and Tokyo Joshi Pro, maybe Stardom, that I think it would behoove AEW to send wrestlers on excursion, but that's like never happened, right?
No, it hasn't happened.
AAA, yeah.
It hasn't happened, and you think about and Jade is kind of Jade is closer to the way WWE uses Ronda Rousey or even Logan Paul, is almost like she's not like a celebrity signing, but she was pushed from her very first match and was given consistent TV time every single week, and it was a different type of project than you would normally see. But I look at someone like Brock Anderson, who you presumably want to do something with in pro wrestling. I'm looking at his cage match right now. He's had 47 career matches, and he's been wrestling for 3 years. He's only had 5 matches in 2023. He's had 4 in AEW and 1 in Ring of Honor. He did work, a few indie dates here and there last year, so he has done some indie dates. But that's just probably not enough matches for someone to really find themselves. And they're, again, they're going to struggle to find their way on television when they're competing with, some of the biggest names in the industry and some of the most talented wrestlers in the world.
Like, what would be the reasons why they're not working indies more? I understand people who are more developed and who have, they're already perceived as excellent wrestlers, that they don't want to go out there and risk injury unless it's for a good enough price. But for, as you said, the Brock Andersons of the world, Jade Cargill's, it doesn't serve AEW.
Yeah. So what is the what was the prior motivation for people to work? What's the main motivation for people who are on the indies right now to work the indies? Why travel? Why go to different shows?
For all the money you make, to develop your career so that you eventually get signed by somebody and to make a little bit of money in the meantime, at least so you're not losing money. And people on the high end certainly are making money and selling, especially if they're selling merchandise well, to get your name out there, brother.
Right. You want to get better. You want to get seen by more people, and you want to eventually get signed by probably either WWE or AEW. So you can start making like a real career in professional wrestling. And if you are someone who's already been signed by AEW and you're being paid whatever, a downside guarantee or whatever, however their contracts are structured, there's not nearly
there's
the
no
same
financial incentive.
Yeah, and if you're already, like, if you're a Jade Cargill, for example, who's independently very wealthy and is married to, a former MLB baseball player, what is the motivation for me to be like, I'm already signed by AEW. I'm already pushed on television. I win all my matches on television. I'm presented like a star. I have this title that I had for over a year. What is my motivation to go work, an indie in front of 250 people somewhere?
Financially, it's not there. I guess the argument would be that if you want to become an even bigger star for AEW, Jade Cargill and Brock Anderson need a lot more experience to get a lot better than they are because they're not very good in the ring yet. Jade Cargill's got a lot of star power, but is she a great wrestler who's meeting her potential as far as being an even bigger star and being capable of having great matches? No. And the way that's going to happen is not just in the matches. Like, I don't have any belief here that she's going to have. She'll come back eventually, I guess, but I don't have a belief that she's going to become like a high-end match quality capable wrestler just through the matches she's going to have in AEW.
Right. And I think that but I think if I'm Jade, I'm like, why do I have to become a good wrestler?
You don't. If you're happy with the level that you're at, I mean, that's
presented
cool.
As a star. She's marketed by AEW as, a signature star for them. She's on, she had merchandise. She's on, the cover of posters. From her end, it's like,
if we're WWE or AEW, I would want her not necessarily work the U.S. Indies. Maybe that's not the most efficient place to develop at this point either. But maybe we talk to, let's have you do a tour in Japan. Maybe Stardom will take you, maybe AAA or something like that. I think that those would be really worthwhile excursions to go on to develop talent.
Yeah, and I think you're also talking about, like, from the working the U.S. independents is, especially now that AEW has, a weekly show on Saturday nights. Like, if you're working the independents, like, are you going to be out there every weekend doing a match? That's a lot more travel in addition to if you're traveling to be around AEW television. So, like, and even if Jade Cargill was working one indie match a month, that's really not going to amount to an enormous amount of extra ring time, especially given the additional travel that will probably come with it. If we're talking about like an international excursion, like if she were to go to Stardom or maybe Tokyo Joshi Pro, you could go there for a few weeks and you could wrestle a dozen matches over that time period. And then you're talking about a much more substantial kind of investment based on time in getting more ring time, getting more matches, working with different opponents, as opposed to the indies, which is probably not that efficient.
You would work with. And the quality of the talent you'd work with in Stardom or Tokyo Joshi Pro or AAA would probably be better than the quality of talent that you would be able to work with on U.S. Indies.
Especially as a woman.
Unless they let her do intergender matches.
which you could do, and it might be good for her. I mean, that would be the point. But I don't think we're going to see it with Jade. I mean, but you can say Brock Anderson. You can say like, I think like other, like, they signed Alan Angels based on kind of one match he had with Kenny Omega, and they gave him something on television. They put him in a group, and he had some matches. But I think he was the person to say like, I need to go somewhere where I can wrestle more regularly, and it's just not going to be in AEW. So I know he's gone to Impact. I know he's back on the Indies, and I haven't looked at his cage match recently, but I assume he's working more regularly, and he's working a variety of different opponents, and he's very young, and he's kind of basically, he made the decision of being, I'm not cool with just taking an AEW paycheck. I want to do something more with my career. And obviously and it goes both ways, because even though if AEW is like, oh, we don't really, we signed Alan Angels, but we don't really have anything else for him, we're not going to offer him a new contract or something like that. And you could say, well, that's AEW's fault because they never gave him an opportunity. But at the end of the day, you're going to be a guy without a job. So it does behoove talent to kind of take their own agency as far as like pushing for, whether it's working more indies, like talent. Like I know Max Caster, I mentioned already. I believe Darius Martin or Dante Martin both have worked a substantial amount of indies since being signed by AEW. There are talent out there that are putting in that kind of work. And I think in AEW, it's like you're kind of asking the talent to want to commit to that, to want to be great. And some talent is going to be willing to do that, and other talent's just gonna be like, I'm cool making I'm on TV occasionally, and I'm making it. I'm in a big wrestling promotion, and I'm making it as a pro wrestler. And I think that's what most people aspire to do. And maybe they don't see themselves climbing up the card, or don't really care to.
I think it's going to be a question because we're what, 4 years into AEW now, just passed, right? If you count Double or Nothing as the beginning. And how many wrestlers are there who you would say have had a lot of upward mobility in terms of their position on the card in AEW? MJF stands out as one, right? Are there others? Orange Cassidy, I guess.
Yeah, I would say Orange has definitely, I mean, the Acclaimed,
Yes.
Caster and Bowens. I would say Jungle Boy is up. I would say Sammy is up too, although Sammy getting in the Jericho Appreciation Society at an early stage probably helped them. As far as guys who have been positioned at a higher level than they started. I would say
I guess Darby. I mean, these are people who feel like bigger stars now. I would say more so through the attrition of having been on television for 4 years, as opposed to, are they in a lot higher position on the card than where they started?
Yeah. I would say the Guns. They were tag team champions earlier this year, from where they started, which was one of them wasn't even a wrestler. So I'd rate that. Billy Gunn is definitely in a better spot than he was when he first started.
I think there's a lot of potential in Billy Gunn.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're in the airport and you see, the AEW roster, whose head are you turning when you see that?
I'm going to vote for him for most underrated in the Wrestling Observer newsletter award.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's more. I would say, no. I guess people might push back on this, but Wardlow, in the sense of, he was basically just a guy on the indies that most people hadn't heard of when he was first signed by AEW.
Yeah, but I question how. I think that's going to be a problem for AEW in terms of developing talent up the card as the years go on here, where I don't think AEW's television time and ring time alone is enough to develop talent as efficiently as they would like to.
And I think this goes back to the indies, because of the arms race, because of WWE being really aggressive and AEW in turn being really aggressive at signing talent at early stages. Talent is not necessarily being allowed to ferment on the indies at the same way that they were prior to WWE getting aggressive and prior to AEW's existence. And what does that mean? AEW is in a lot of cases built off of the strength of talent that came up through the American indies, talent like the Young Bucks, And even people that they've signed since then that, came from WWE, people like Adam Cole, people like Swerve. Those are talent that were, again, products of the American Indies. And you wonder, like, okay, who are going to be AEW's stars of, in 5 years, and they want to bring in like a young name, like, or a new name, like they're going to start with, they're inherently going to have somebody who's greener than the Young Bucks or Adam Cole when they sign them. And how can that person kind of, matriculate through AEW and find their way up the card? And I think that's going to be a real question that will have to be answered. And AEW, they've signed, they've signed to at least some sort of deal. I'm not sure the exact specifics, but they've signed Billy Starks, they've signed Nick Wayne, people that are 18 years old. What are their careers going to be like in AEW? Like as an 18-year-old, when you're realistically, 15 years away from your traditional prime as a pro wrestler, how does that person matriculate through the system? That's that's very interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, again, farming your talent out to your partners. Yeah, I'm surprised it's something that hasn't happened yet in terms of sending people to AAA or to the Japanese promotions. It seems like a really good way to develop good relationships with those companies and to get something in return eventually. So it's a mystery to me, other than, the talent may be satisfied because they're getting paid well enough to live. But it seems kind of like AEW is warehousing talent and not using them as much as they could, which is, they're not getting injured, but they're not developing either.
Yeah, and I would expect when AEW first started, I think we expected a lot more kind of excursions and talent doing tours in other places because they had these relationships with other companies. And that has never really materialized. We had the closest we have is like Wheeler, Utah worked at Best of the Super Juniors tournament, which you could describe as, and like Lance Archer worked like a G1, and Eddie Kingston's going to work the G1 this year. But those are, talent that are over the age of 40. That's not necessarily like people going to learn that much going over there, as opposed to you can make a case for like Wheeler, Utah being he probably did learn when he was in the Best of Super Juniors, and he's probably someone that's in a better position, now than he was back then. But a lot of these talent that do get in better positions are like Wheeler Utah's in a better position really because he's in a stable that's pushed heavily, not necessarily like as independent act. Is he taking?
And I would say in ring, I mean, Wheeler Yuta is a very good wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
Already, he was a very good wrestler when I wrestled him in 2019. He was good,
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
the things he needs to develop are other things.
Right. He was a like a TV ready talent when he was signed to AEW, which is most of the fact that's most of the people that they are going to sign. I think it'll be really interesting to see. Well, let me shift gears a little bit because I think we talked about this on an episode of WrestleNomics after Double or Nothing, but Bryan Danielson was talking about talent getting over and training talent and developing talent in the press conference, and he mentioned something along the lines of talent that have good fundamentals, and he mentioned Daniel Garcia as a specific example. Talent that have good fundamentals are better suited than talent that can necessarily do extraordinary things. And he mentioned, Daniel Garcia maybe would get over immediately if he was like Commander and could do a bunch of, crazy high spots that people would immediately react to. But in the long run, when the pops kind of dry up for doing the same kind of high spots, Daniel Garcia is a much better position for whatever his, whatever turn his career takes, because he has these solid fundamentals to pivot to. If he needs to be a babyface now. Oh, he needs to be a heel now. Oh, he needs to wrestle this way. Oh, he needs to wrestle that way. Having the fundamentals that allow you to kind of transition between different styles and different roles is a superior way to kind of establish yourself as a wrestler, even though it might not be the most immediate way to success. And I thought that was a really interesting answer, to a question, and making me think a lot about, like, is it bad in some cases if talent shows some potential in some way early, because then expectations become greater, and then if you don't live up to those expectations, you're seen as disappointment, or the company's seen as disappointing for failing, when realistically it was just kind of an outcome of expectation, oversized expectations.
Yeah, what came to mind from that point that he made was the troubling incentive, which is really pronounced, I think, on the indies in at least one way, to get over right away, versus having patience. Because, if you're an indie worker and you want to get booked in as many places as possible, there's a lot of pressure to do something that just gets you over right away. And I think the things that get you over right away, at least on the indies, maybe beyond that, are the things that, make you kind of a comedy act or a novelty act, as opposed to, I think, like, somebody said something about Bret Hart, which was, or maybe it was about Steve Austin anyway. They said, you're not going to get over right away, but once you're over, you'll be over for good. And there's so much about wrestling culture, I would say, that doesn't allow for that, and then therefore does not allow wrestlers to get as over as they could, and therefore does not allow wrestling companies to make as much money as they could, because there's a lot of rewarding instant gratification, or instant people who get over instantly, come out dancing or something like that. All right, there's a wrestler who I came up with who should be a major wrestling star today, and because he was so good, and at a certain point, a few years in, I think he got this kind of affected him, and he became less of a serious wrestler, and he became somebody who leaned more on being silly, and shouting out ridiculous things and wearing ridiculous things. And his choice to do that, he saw as being immediately rewarded, because do you think he would say things to the effect of, do you think people gave a shit about me when I was doing that stupid serious act? No, they care about me now because I'm doing this. And on its face, you couldn't argue with them. The reason why he's not a major wrestling star is not related to this necessarily. Different.
I thought we were talking about Seth Rollins.
Seth Rollins. No, I know. No, I never met Seth Rollins. But I think he could have been, if he had stuck to that serious act that he didn't want to do anymore. I think if he pursued it, there was an outing for him to become, like a major star in Ring of Honor, doing work rate matches that people on the internet loved and would travel, hundreds and hundreds of miles to come see. But that the culture that we have in wrestling doesn't reward that. It rewards, people who do funny, ironic gimmicks that get over very quickly because, oh, I know exactly what I've got here. It's a known quantity. Promoter notices it and books you, versus having the patience to let somebody get over, which sort of systematically in indie wrestling is not there, right? Your indie promotions are running a show once a month, maybe. So there's certainly no week to week to really develop somebody to see how they get over time, because you're only being seen by a given audience maybe once a month, maybe less frequently. There is more of a pressure to do something silly, and therefore that gets over, but gets over at a more shallow level.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, especially because, do you think part of that
is related to what Danielson said somehow?
Yeah, but do you think a part of that? Well, and that's kind of what basically Danielson said was like, like, again, using Daniel Garcia as an example, it's like he would probably get more instantly over if he came out and did, some exciting high spots or things like that.
Or if he danced.
He
does that.
Well, look, the dance is getting over. But but to talk about Daniel Garcia's like the dance gets over, but if the dance has a shelf life, right?
God, I hope so.
The dance has a shelf life, and he is positioned to if the dance no longer gets over, and his character isn't really based around the dance. That's not really how his character. But the thing is, if that stops getting over to the degree that it's over at, he can move on to something else because he has the fundamentals to kind of do anything else. As opposed to, oh, I get over doing this one trick, let me keep doing that, and then all of a sudden you lose the kind of patience that it would take to develop a broader skill set to allow you to succeed in kind of any situation. I do wonder if like this is influenced at all, especially when you reference the indies, and definitely like when we see things on television, like if it's influenced at all, like how we analyze pro wrestling, in that like each week there is a episode of Raw, an episode of Dynamite, an episode of SmackDown, and then we talk about what happened on that show. And people will be critical of something, especially if it's like the first time we saw something. I think Jungle Boy's promo on Wednesday night is a good example. Jungle Boy's first ever heel promo. He comes out, cuts a heel promo. I think it got mixed reactions, but everyone is talking about, oh, his heel promo. Oh, it's no good. It's this, it's that. And it's like, well, it's his first ever heel promo. Like, I think there's pressure on him to immediately establish himself as this incredible heel character that's very different than his previous character. But the truth is, it's only his first ever heel promo. Like, it's going to take time for him to get that down, and we shouldn't be necessarily so reactionary to the first time he ever did it. It's probably going to take months, and it's probably going to take dozens of times of him doing it for him to really tap into his potential in that role. But does professional wrestling have the patience for that? Does the fans?
It would be nice if there was somewhere for him to have experiences like that before actually doing them on television too. But I guess you're saying that like you think the analysis of a wrestler's performance, like Jungle Boy, his promo, people on online, I guess, and reviewing shows, not that saying it's not that great, that then emboldens or helps already make up the mind of the audience that's going to be there week to week in the arenas.
I think that influences it in some way. It depends. If it depends on an individual. A talent might be pretty reactive to stuff that they see on social media. Another talent might be totally ignorant of it. A promoter or booker or key decision maker might be cognizant of what they're saying online. Someone like Vince McMahon doesn't care, doesn't know, and doesn't care. So it's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. But when I talk about, like, I do think that there's an expectation for immediate returns on something, like, to use an example, is like Jungle Boy's heel promo. There was an expectation that he was going to be immediately a much different and presumably better talker than he was as a babyface. He's kind of the same from a delivery standpoint as a heel. And that realistically should be expected given his experience level. But I think some people demand more because the idea is he's starting this new character and it's going to kind of be over instantly. And I wonder if that has an influence on how long we see this character and how he's presented going forward.
Yeah, I think if he cuts a good promo, I think regardless of how many people have buried his previous promos in their review shows, I think it's going to get over alive with the audience. Let's take a look at a more extreme case to like see if this is true. Like, people perceive broadly, whether it's true or not, people perceive broadly Baron Corbin to not be a good wrestler. If Baron Corbin has a match that is genuinely great, whatever that means, is it going to get over? Probably, regardless of what the fans have predisposed in their minds, I think.
Yeah. I think I'm thinking about, like, from a patient's perspective, and that, like, fans naturally are not going to be willing to give Jungle Boy probably enough time, Jack Perry, enough time to grow into this role that would probably be required for him to really excel in it, because there's pressure on him to be good at it immediately. And that's probably not good from a talent development perspective. I think, and the other thing is,
and the patience is incumbent on Tony Khan then.
Right. And I think the whole 4 pillars marketing strategy, using that as a brand, I don't think that did anyone any favors. I don't think leaning into it, I think it put a lot of pressure on talents that we largely had no idea how good they were going to be on as characters on a weekly national television show. Obviously MJF has excelled. I would say that Darby has done pretty well himself. I would say Sammy and Jack Perry are behind. And it puts a lot of pressure on them especially when you don't really know how good they're going to be. We've seen it in WWE plenty of times. Vince McMahon becomes infatuated with somebody. They push them kind of hard, present them as a star, usually well before they're ready. And it has had a lot of negative impacts on a lot of different careers. And I do think that is a strategy that some wrestling companies are using. And I don't know if like the juice is worth the squeeze on that one. I think it's a risky bet to put a lot of pressure on talent that you're uncertain about how good they're going to be, because it sets a very high bar and allows people to be easily disappointed when they don't hit it.
How did in the case of AEW, where did the four, not all Japan Pro Wrestling, where did the four pillars, was that an AEW choice? Was that, branding that they embraced? I don't remember.
I want to say that it was MJF mentioned it in a promo, and he mentioned that those specific names. I want to say that was the case. I'm not 100% sure if that's exactly what happened, but if my memory serves, that was right. But AEW has leaned into it. They sold merchandise. They had people bring it up.
It's been mentioned in promos for sure,
other promos and things like that. Obviously, the four-way at Double or Nothing was built around the idea that these are the four pillars, which is obviously inspired by All Japan Pro Wrestling, the four pillars of heaven. And so the AEW leaned into that and embraced that label. And I think it has hurt talent, especially when you look at the AEW roster since that original promo was cut, and think about all the other young talent that they have added, and talent that you could say is more deserving of a main event push than what we have seen from Sammy Guevara or Jack Perry so far. And I'm not necessarily disappointed in Sammy Guevara or Jack Perry's performances in AEW. I think that they have done a lot of great things as talents, but you put them in a position where they're going to be the future world champions, and that's a high bar to clear. And most wrestlers that are put in that position are not going to succeed. You have to be really confident in them, I think, to kind of give them that label.
Yeah, I think that label was placed at a time when AEW's talent depth was not nearly as deep as it is now.
Right. It wasn't outrageous at the time. It's like, oh, really? You're going to build the future around Jack Perry? And it's like, well, yeah, he's really young. He didn't have a lot of experience before he was signed. He clearly has kind of an intangible babyface charisma that you can't really teach, that people like. Obviously, his dad was this famous celebrity and he looks just like him. It wasn't like a crazy thing to suggest that. Just over time, if you were to say like, okay, if I'm looking at my under 35 prospects in AEW, is Jack Perry one of the four prospects he would look at pushing the most? Probably not. And that's kind of the standard he needs to hit.
But at the time, maybe.
Yeah.
In 2019, whenever that label got placed on.
But you're putting that label for the future. It's not just a time and place. Yeah. Especially because you keep bringing it up. We've seen it. I was actually thinking about this when I was thinking about talent development, especially when I was thinking about WWE's roster. I was thinking, we haven't had like a Vince McMahon guy in a while. Like, your Bobby Lashley's, your Chris Masters, like, was Lars Sullivan like the last Vince McMahon guy? Like someone that they were just going to push like really hard, kind of, because
by Vince McMahon guy, you mean someone who's tall and really muscular.
Yeah. And that gets pushed like when they're really green. Like we haven't had one of those in like a while.
Almost is really big and tall, but not really muscular. And he's not a bodybuilder type anyway.
Right. And they never really went all the way with Almost. Like
it seems Paul is pumping the brakes on him. But other names that Otis and Montez Ford, definitely not. I mean, those aren't people who've been super pushed either, but those are just pure projects. Is it somebody in the type of, Mason Ryan or Matt Morgan or
right? These people used to pop up like every 6 months or so. There'd be like a new Vince guy, a Tom McGee type wrestler. If we haven't had one of those in a while, I guess some would say Austin Theory, but I don't think he's like protected at all. in the way that you would look at like these guys who would get monster pushes would be.
Batista would be sort of. I mean, not that he was pushed that way necessarily, but
Look, everyone is who gets like wins a world title and stuff like that is a Vince guy. Like you could say Roman Reigns is obviously like a perfect Vince guy, but Roman, despite my criticism,
Brock Lesnar.
Yeah, but despite my criticisms of Roman obviously is much more substantially talented than a lot of, and had, you know, a lot more kind of experience than some of these guys that you're mentioning, like your Matt Morgans, your Mason Ryans, Bobby Lashley when he first got started up, Chris Masters, like these guys who really were really green, not ready yet, got pretty prominent roles on television early in their careers and were protected in booking because they had a certain look that Vince was infatuated by, and Vince saw the next Hulk Hogan or the next Steve Austin in them, and then he gives up on them. And I think Lars Sullivan was kind of the last guy I feel like who really kind of had that, and that just obviously didn't work out for a number of reasons. Drew McIntyre,
Madcap Moss is close, but he obviously wasn't pushed that way.
Yeah, I guess they're a little bit more protective of these guys. Like you go back and say like Sheamus when he was made WWE champion, and the idea was that he was going to be a huge babyface champion. His career has been much more successful than the other guys who kind of burned out quickly. But I'm surprised given the youth movement, the frustration with NXT. Obviously, Vince has been, I guess, in and out of power over the last year or so, but I'm surprised we haven't seen like a new like Vince project really come up and get a huge giant push.
As Braun Strowman would be a good one, right? Who is in developmental right now? Who's in NXT or deeper in developmental? That
right? You even don't even
fit.
See like like Braun Breaker is protected, but he's she's too short basically to have like the look that Vince really likes. But there's not like a guy in NXT who's really being pushed. I mean, that part of it is like NXT right now. We've talked about this on WrestleNomics. NXT is kind of being gamed during TV, rights negotiation season. NXT is trying to be presented as more of a serious third brand than necessarily as developmental. And if you look at the NXT television and who is kind of wrestling a lot of matches and the NXT takeovers and kind of who are being featured on those programs, it's not a bunch of green people that have only been wrestling for under a year. It's a lot of veterans, a lot more people with independent experience and things like that. So it's a little bit different.
Yep.
No. Okay. Is there anything else that any other topic or a thing related to this that we didn't get to?
I don't know. I mean, like, I haven't trained in since early 2020. I've been there a couple times, but I haven't, been the one who's been training people. I mean, I kind of touched on it, but like as far as the things that I think made our training relatively successful is these weren't huge classes with like 30 people. I was training like 5 people at a time, and I wanted people who were there often. I guess that's not an issue if you're hired to do it. But and I felt like I could teach people the fundamentals if I was just given the time to do it. And I'd be curious to know what WWE's process is like. In most cases, I could negotiate somebody's body into doing the fundamentals of wrestling. Yeah, and just sort of instilling a vision of wrestling that is beyond WWE, which sort of by its nature in WWE you're not going to get, I guess. But who knows what they really think and what they really study when cameras are off. But yeah, I just it's curious why there isn't better development there than there is.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Brandon, for coming onto the show. I want to thank all of my listeners and all of the kind words and compliments I've gotten for the last few episodes. I really appreciate that. We're definitely getting a really positive feedback for the show over the last few months. So I want to thank everyone who's reached out and said nice things about the show, whether it's on social media or personally or things like that. I really do appreciate that kind of stuff. But again, thank everyone for listening, and I'll talk to you again in a while.
Hello, Voices of Wrestling listener. Dave Ryan here. Have you ever wondered to yourself how many hidden gems are hidden away inside the last years of World Championship Wrestling? Have you ever asked yourself how many tenuous gags can be made about the name Mike Enos? And have you ever thought about what it sounds like for two Irishmen to interpret a very chaotic company through its B-show? The answers to all this and more are just a click away. Check out Days of Thunder every second Thursday on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
Hi, my name is Tyler Fornes, and I am the co-host of The Good, the Bad, and the Hunky here on the Voice of Wrestling Podcasting Network. Every week, my co-host Fred Moreland and I discuss all the happenings of All Elite Wrestling and everything going on in the universe of Tony Khan. We talk about Dynamite, we talk about Rampage, and we will talk about Collision when the time comes as well, along with all the appearances outside of AEW from all the best talents in All Elite Wrestling. This is one of the more cohesive wrestling companies in the entire world, and we discuss every intricacy about it, including the unique booking of Tony Khan that is both a huge positive and a major detriment. Check us out every single Thursday here on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network.